This screencast is going to be about nutrient cycling, basically how different atoms and molecules cycle through different forms within an ecosystem. So an important thing to understand is that matter, meaning atoms and molecules, cycles through biological systems. It changes forms, so it might, be bonded to different things, but it is never really lost. The same atoms that are on Earth today are the atoms that were on Earth, millions, billions of years ago. They've just kind of been going around and around and around through different forms. An example of this is the water cycle. Um, Except for a little bit that's come in from like comets that have crashed onto the Earth, most of the water we have today is the same water that was there when there were dinosaurs, the same water that was there, even before that. You have molecules of water in your body that were once part of dinosaur pee. It's a true fact. So the water cycle, we won't go into too much, but you have water accumulating in oceans, rivers, lakes. That water evaporates into clouds. Then the clouds rain down that water onto surfaces, and then it runs back into oceans, rivers, lakes, etc. So the water just kind of goes around and around and around. It's always the same water. It's just changing forms from liquid to gas and back to liquid again. Similarly, those atoms and molecules that are important for building biological molecules, remember CHOPS, these also cycle through an ecosystem. Some important cycles include a carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, and phosphorus cycle. For this class, we will be focusing on carbon and nitrogen and how those two move through an ecosystem. So here is a diagram of the carbon cycle, and I'll just go through a few points. So let's start in the atmosphere, which is another way of saying the air. So in the air, we know there is carbon in the form of carbon dioxide, which you hear about a lot with regards to climate change, since that is a greenhouse gas that helps trap heat from the sun. There is also methane gas, which is CH4, that's another greenhouse gas. For the most part, we're concerned about the carbon dioxide. So let's say we start with carbon dioxide in the air. Now, how does carbon dioxide get out of the air? Well, two main ways. It can be taken in by plants through the process of photosynthesis. Through photosynthesis, plants take carbon dioxide out of the air and turn it into organic molecules like sugars and starches. It can also dissolve into water. The ocean actually absorbs a lot of carbon dioxide. A lot of carbon dioxide from the air gets absorbed into the ocean and other bodies of water. Now from there, let's say we're looking at some carbon that has been taken in by a plant through photosynthesis. One option is something might eat that plant. Perhaps an animal might eat that plant. And so the carbon would go from the plant to the animal. Now when that animal breathes or respires, respiration, that animal breathes carbon dioxide back out into the air. Another option that could happen is perhaps that animal dies. When the animal dies, it will decompose, and sometimes as it decomposes, that carbon just again gets released back out into the air. Sometimes, for example, if it dies at the bottom of the ocean or like in a swamp or something like that, it may turn into some kind of goop at the bottom of the ocean, sediments, and eventually with lots of time, some of those dead and decomposed animals, and also plants, same with plants, when they die, they also can decompose. And so eventually, with lots of time, some of those dead and decomposed plants and animals may become fossil fuels, like coal, gas, or oil. So now there's a lot of carbon stored in these fossil fuels that are buried in the ground under the ocean. Now, if humans burn those fossil fuels in power plants or in cars, then that carbon that's stored in those fossil fuels goes right back out into the atmosphere. And then similarly, if someone were to burn plants, like say they were to, burn the Amazon rainforest, a bunch of that, all that carbon that's stored in those plants again goes back out into the atmosphere. Yeah, there's combustion. And then finally, another source of carbon in the atmosphere can be geological activity. Volcanoes and such do release carbon-containing gases out into the atmosphere as well. So these slides are just the words summarizing what I went through on that diagram. So I would pause the video here so that you can write down these points. The other cycle we're going to be looking at is the nitrogen cycle and how nitrogen cycles through an ecosystem. So again, we will start in the atmosphere, in the air. Most of the nitrogen in the air is in a form N2, nitrogen gas. So it's two nitrogen atoms bonded together. In general, animals and plants cannot actually access this nitrogen. There's a lot of nitrogen in the air, and you breathe it in, but you just breathe it right back out. You're not really capable of separating these two nitrogens because they're actually held together by a triple bond. It's hard to break that bond. So you just breathe it in and breathe it right back out. But animals and plants need nitrogen. We need nitrogen because nitrogen is needed to make our proteins and our DNA. And remember, proteins are really important. They do a lot of things. So how do we get nitrogen? So there is a process called nitrogen fixation, and that is turning nitrogen that is N2 in the atmosphere into forms that can be used by living things. And there's two ways that that happens. One way is it can randomly happen by lightning. Like lightning can literally split up these nitrogens and then have them rain into the soil. But the main way that happens is through special bacteria that live in the soil and also in the water that are able to break down this nitrogen and put it into the soil. And so we call those nitrogen fixing bacteria. There's some different forms nitrogen kind of can go through in the soil or the water, and you don't need to worry about those so much. But just know the process. There is nitrogen fixation. Nitrogen goes into the soil. Now it can be taken up by plants. Plants take in that nitrogen through their roots. And then animals can eat those plants, and that way they can get their nitrogen, because animals and plants both need nitrogen. Now, when animals or plants die, they decompose, and other bacteria can eventually release that nitrogen back into the air as N2, or it can just return to the soil. And that's why, compost, for example, makes good fertilizer. Fertilizer that you put on plants is mostly nitrogen. And so decomposed plants and animals, their remains contain that nitrogen that the plants need. Another thing that can happen is that humans can artificially create stores of nitrogen and make fertilizer out of it. And one thing that can happen with that is that that extra nitrogen that we put into the soil can actually be washed away by the rain into oceans, lakes, and rivers, where it will fertilize all of the algae in those oceans, lakes, rivers, etc., and can actually cause some pretty big problems. It can cause these giant blooms of algae, and some kinds of algae are toxic. So sometimes drinking water in certain places won't be safe because there's these big algae blooms, or they might kill off animals that live in that water because, again, some of those algae are toxic. So again, here is the written out version of what I was just talking about. You can pause again to write this down and also the next slide. And here is the second slide of that. So you can pause again to write this. And then just a couple pictures of those algae blooms I was talking about that can occur when too much nitrogen gets released into the water through rain, through runoff. So this is Lake Erie, and you can see it's like just completely green with algae. And here's another example of a giant algae bloom.